Big thank you to Mira and Angela and the whole Dyson team, and particularly to Melanie Dupuy, who spent countless hours organizing this. And I think the quality of the presentations is attributable to you. And I'm really looking forward to this. I also want to recognize our trustee, Lillian Haub, and mention that in addition to a wonderful, wonderful program in Dyson College, we also have the #1 rated environmental law program in the country at the Haub School of Law. So thank you, Lillian. Thank you, colleagues from Dyson. I think I was selected to do this because I am truly a lay person in this field. And so my comments are going to be directed at trying to understand the different points of view here and to engage in a dialogue. And at the end, time allowing, we'll have some questions and answers. So my goal is to stimulate the discussion and to bring out the expertise of both of our panelists. And I'm very grateful to both of you for being with us today. So let's start, Tim. We'll start with both of you, but I want to start, Tim. What led you to believe that beef consumption must be drastically reduced?
So, is this too loud? No. The world faces a huge challenge. We have to produce about 50% more food by 2050 to feed a growing population. Agriculture already occupies about half of the world's vegetated land, and it generates about a quarter of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. And in order to solve climate change, we need to produce 50% more food while not expanding agricultural land at all. And most strategies assume that we're going to actually reduce agricultural land area and reforest it to get the carbon savings. And while generating 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions we produce today. 50% more food, 1/3 of the emissions. Now, globally, about 70% of the world's land is devoted to ruminant livestock. So 2/3 of the world's agricultural land is grazing land, and about 1/3 of that was naturally forested. And even in the United States, about 80 million acres of land, about 20% of our agricultural land is cropland devoted just to beef production. And then we have tens of millions of acres of additional land that was historically forested that is grazed. So in addition to the kind of dry grazing land in the West. So ruminants generate about half of the greenhouse gas emissions from all diets and use, as I said, about 70% of the land. And beef is peculiarly inefficient. So beef generates about 3% of our calories, and it occupies about half of the land burden of our diets and about half of the greenhouse gas emissions. Mm-hmm. So basically, the bottom line is just beef is extraordinarily inefficient. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that you don't need beef production to be done extremely well. So in the non-food context, people understand this very well. If you say, we need to drive less, but when we drive, we need to drive a Prius or an electric car, everyone gets that. The same is true of food. We need to eat less beef, but that doesn't mean we don't value really good beef production. And that really good beef production can be done in a lot of different ways, including terrific grazing ways. And so we need both. But it's just the same as in almost any other activity. We have to hold down our consumption. So when we model out kind of strategies for possibly achieving this unbelievably challenging task, and there's no way to do it unless basically the world's larger beef consumers consume about 50% less beef. Only about 20% of the world's population consumes significant amounts of beef and generates all that emissions and uses all that land. So we have to hold down our consumption in part because that 80% wants to consume at least a little bit more. And unless we hold down ours, they can't consume even hardly any more. So that's basically a thumbnail sketch.
Tim, what percentage would you say the United States consumes of beef?
The global beef consumption? You know, I don't know that off the top of my head, but maybe 15, 20%, something like that. I'll have to check.
Okay, all right. Nicolette, now I understand you were a vegetarian for many years.
33 years.
33 years, okay. And you believed at the time that livestock was environmentally destructive, I gather?
Yes.
Yes. So what has
I wouldn't say I believe that for the whole 33 years.
Okay.
But that was certainly why I stopped eating meat at the beginning.
Okay. And so I'm curious what your evolution is and what your position is on some of the things that Tim was saying about beef consumption.
Yeah, well, I think there are some assumptions in the statistics that were just presented that should be examined just to start. And the first is this notion of how much we have to increase production of food in order to feed the rising population. Because we know that globally, a huge percentage of food is thrown away, and in the US, it's believed to be around 40% of the production. So I think just right from the start, we actually can feed 1.5 times the global population right now, but about 800 million people in the world don't get enough to eat. So we know there's a tremendous inefficiency in terms of connecting food that is produced with populations, and that's all types of food. And in fact, fruits and vegetables are the most perishable, and it's the most thrown away food. So we have tremendous inefficiencies in the US and elsewhere. Secondly, with respect to land usage, and these are some of the things that I have learned a lot more about. I've been working, I started working as an environmental lawyer, actually, interestingly, at Pace Law School with Bobby Kennedy Jr. I was a senior attorney for Waterkeeper Alliance. And I went to University of Michigan Law School, by the way. So we've got that Go Blue connection. All right. But so I started looking at that issue at that time because I had been hired by Bobby specifically to work on meat industry pollution concerns. And I had already been a vegetarian for over a decade at that time, and I believed, as many people do nowadays, that meat was inherently environmentally problematic. But the more I worked on it, and I spent 2 full years working as an environmental lawyer for Waterkeeper Alliance, focused exclusively on meat-related issues, the more I worked on it, the more I read, the more I traveled and visited places and saw what was happening in the field, literally in the field, my views began to shift quite a bit. And this question of land use is one thing I became much more clear on through the last 20 years of really working on this issue. And the most important thing to understand is that over 3/4 of the land that is grazed globally and in the United States, in the US it's estimated to be about 80%, is land which cannot be farmed, okay? So this is basically rangeland and other types of grazing land. In some cases, it is forested land or sort of silvopasture type, which has both trees and open areas. And this is actually where most of the grazing takes place. So those are areas, if you reduce the grazing or took the cattle or other grazing animals off the land, it would actually fall out of food production. So the notion that is very commonly talked about in sort of mainstream discussions is that you have this large area of land being used for cattle grazing. It's very inefficient. We need to basically take the cattle off of there, and then it can be used for more efficient calorie production. But that's really a kind of a distorted view of the whole thing. Now, as far as my own personal evolution on the issue, I married the founder of a sustainable meat company that's based in California called Niman Ranch after the 2 years that I had worked at Waterkeeper, where I first encountered the people working in the Niman Ranch network, including my husband, Bill Niman. And it surprised a lot of people when I didn't start eating meat right away because they said, well, you've got the best meat in the world. Why wouldn't you eat it? And we've been married for 17 years, and I went for 16.5 years without eating any meat because that was what I had been doing for a long, long time. But I recently, just about 6 months ago, began eating meat because I realized I was advocating for meat everywhere, and increasingly I really believed it would be better for my own health to be eating meat. And so I began to reincorporate meat in my diet. I don't think everybody needs to eat meat, but I really reject the vilification of meat because I think it is a real food. It is a healthy food. It is far healthier than many of the alternatives. And when you look at the demographic data about what people have been shifting toward dietarily, we have dramatically reduced red meat consumption in the United States at the same time that we have dramatically increased our consumption of sugar, processed carbohydrates, and other processed foods. And so a lot of the dietary, health-related problems we have in the United States today, I believe, are due to that shift. So I think it's very important, and I'm really glad that Adele Height is here to speak this afternoon about and we haven't actually met, but I am a big fan. She writes a lot about nutrition and health and meat as an important part of that. And I think that's an important part of the discussion as well, although I know we're primarily talking about the ecological question.
Yeah, Tim, go ahead.
Yeah. So first, I agree, don't vilify, because it's like vilifying cars, right? I mean, we do all kinds of things. I eat meat. And it's true that if we ate no meat, then there'd be a bunch of land that wouldn't be used for food production because it's dry grazing land. But we long ago used up all of our grazing land. And as we expand our meat consumption, it comes from clearing basically forest and tropical rainforest. And for example, even in the US, the estimate is that if we tried to just use grazing land, not just native grazing land, but just grazing land, which includes a lot of wetter grazing land in the east, we could only produce about a third of the beef that we produce today. So most of the feed, the vast majority of the weight gain, comes from the addition of crops and hay that's grown on cropland and things like that. So it's correct that if we eliminated all meat consumption in the world, we would be wasting land, and not just land, we'd be wasting some byproducts and things like that. But those are long utilized, and at the margin, as we increase, that basically means less tropical rainforest. And just one more thing, just to highlight the fact. So the actual statistic of how could we feed the world today with today's food production? So the correct statistic is that if none of us ate meat and we had no food waste at all, we could use the remaining crops to feed the world. So actually, that statistic highlights the inefficiencies of meat. So I want to emphasize, I actually spend the vast majority of my effort focused on improving meat production. So I actually spend much less time focused on reducing meat. My analyses show how significant it is, and others work on that. But we have to do both. But there is no, if the world continues to, if the rest of the world tried to eat an American diet, we'd be another planet.
So go ahead.
Okay, well, I want to respond really directly to a couple of points. First of all, I have asked for 20 years, I've been working on this issue very specifically, the environmental implications of meat production. And I have talked to many agricultural economists and others that have tried to estimate what would happen if we, in the United States and globally, completely got rid of feedlots, completely got rid of confined animal feeding operations, because that's what I've been advocating for a long time. So I've been really interested in making the argument that this is feasible. And I've been told again and again that actually we have the land capacity to do this. And most importantly, the Savory Institute based in Colorado says that their research shows that you can get 2 to 3 times as much production, as much sort of output in terms of food production where you use better grazing practices. And Dr. Richard Teague, who's he's one of the world's leading rangeland scientists, who's based at Texas A&M and has done tons of research for decades all over the world in terms of looking specifically at what happens when you do different grazing practices. He just made the statement a few weeks ago that he has research coming out soon that indicates that you can get 4 to 5 times as much beef produced off of land that is using what he calls adaptive management practices, AMP, and some people call it holistic management. But better grazing practices are totally different. So again, it's not the how, it's not the cow, it is the how. That's the thing that I think is so important. We can't just use these blanket statistics. They're actually meaningless. I mean, they mean nothing. Because I can tell you that even we have another person here today from Marin County. In our county alone, just within 20 yards or a few miles, you have very different conditions. And we have learned on our own ranch that we have to manage the grazing differently within our own ranch, which is about 1,000 acres of land. And that we have very different outcomes depending on how we manage. So that is why I think this focus on reduction is so problematic, because it is a red herring. It gets people thinking that that's the solution when the solution really is improving the way things are being done. And because there is really good evidence that I lay out in Defending Beef and in many articles I've written about this, that where you have good grazing, you have many manifold ecological benefits, and you produce healthy food. that to me is really what we need to be focusing on, both as sustainability advocates and sort of as consumers and everything else. We should be looking for that in what we buy. We should be advocating for those kinds of solutions. We should be demanding that policymakers provide methods to improve and to focus on this question of better grazing and better practices overall. But reduction leads people to, down the pathway of thinking that that's the solution, and then there's a kind of a quiescence in thinking, well, I'm a vegan, so I'm not contributing to the problem anymore. Not true.
So what I'm hearing is this debate is sort of between quantity, which Tim says needs to be reduced, and management, which you say needs to be improved. That may be a simplistic way, but let me ask.
But let me just be clear.
Yeah.
I mean, our analyses assume when we try to project how you feed the world in 2050, we need 50% less beef consumption, and we need a doubling of output from grazing land on every potentially improvable grazing land hectare in the world.
Why do you need less beef production?
Because you can't produce. So even if we assume. First of all, there's lots of methane and nitrous oxide, lots of other greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. But just from a land use standpoint, even if we assume that on every hectare that is wet enough to produce significantly more beef, that we double the output, we still need to have a 50% cut in beef consumption. So because this drier grazing land has very limited potential to increase production. The grazing land that has much higher potential is the land that was historically forested. And I work on that in Colombia, for example. And we're trying. It's hard. I mean, it is not easy, and you have to deal with the real world. So as I said, in the real world today, 2/3 of the feed that goes into our beef comes from land that would be cropland or was historically forested, at least. More than that. That's even just from the crops. So yes, it's important to do, just like yield gains, you have to hold down food loss and waste, and you also need to increase yields dramatically. It's just like in cars, it's just like in every other human activity. We have to hold down consumption, and then we need to improve the efficiency of that. It's just, food is no different from anything else.
But wait, the reason we're here today is because, Tim, you and others are making the argument that beef production, and of course consumption drives that production, contributes to climate change, correct?
And lots of other environmental problems.
Okay. And your position is that that's not really true? I'm trying to tease out what the argument is here.
It's incredibly variable depending on how it's done. That is the simple bottom line truth. And so when you sort of give these blanket statements about it being inherently problematic from a climate change or land use or whatever perspective, that can be true, but it is not necessarily true. So the problem that I have is, no, that isn't true. Because, I mean, have you been to Gabe Brown's farm in North Dakota? I mean, and for anyone who hasn't read about his farm, I highly recommend. He wrote a book called Dirt to Soil, which is incredible. He's an extremely credible person who took a conventional cropland, plant crop. It was soybean and corn, very degraded land in North Dakota that he had inherited from his wife's family. And he began trying to restore this. And that wasn't his original goal. He was just trying to make it profitable. But over time, over the last 20 years, he turned it into an incredibly biologically strong, very biodiverse, tons of carbons being sequestered. And the thing he kept doing was increasing the diversity of this place. And what he says, and I've met him several times, and I moderated a couple of panels that he's on, and I've read his book. And he's a very credible person. He says the most important thing that he has done is to add more and more livestock, because that increases the biological functioning of the farm. And what it does is it creates a great deal more diversity starting at the soil level, and that holds more water in the soil when you do that. It creates more diverse vegetation. He has a much more abundant and diverse insect population, a much more abundant and diverse wildlife population. And so starting from the soil up, that's been his focus, is regenerating the soils, not using chemicals, and using nature's tools, primarily livestock. And so this idea that this is like kind of a zero-sum thing, the more livestock, the more problems, it's wrong. It's all about how you do it. And whether you're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, and we can talk about that all you want, because I know a lot about that topic as well, but especially on this land use thing, and this resource usage thing, it is simply inaccurate to put it in this blanket terms. Everything is about how it's done.
So we need the Gabe Pauls of the world. We need to improve our grazing operations where we can. We need to improve our yields in every way we can. And we need to hold down consumption. And so if you have
That's true of cars, because cars are machines that have an output.
No,
But it is not true
Okay,
of
okay,
cattle, because they are part of a natural
I'm not going to do
cycle.
what the CBS moderators did. I'm going to get control of this
Thank
debate.
you. Good.
You two are wonderful. Okay, Tim, you.
Okay. So the reality is, to produce any food requires land, and it requires inputs, and it produces methane and nitrous oxide. And when your cows basically convert feed into edible calories at a ratio of 50 to 100 to 1. So it takes 50 to 100 calories of some kind of feed to produce 1 calorie of beef. And that means you have enormous amounts of land requirements as a result. Now, on any particular farm, you could choose to say, I'm not going to grow corn and soybeans. I'm going to use it for grazing. And that farm will be much more ecologically, particularly if done well, will be much more ecologically vibrant, but you're losing the corn and the soybeans. Now, for example, the vast majority of our meat calories come from pork, chicken, and eggs, and even a lot more from dairy. And they rely extremely heavily on crops. And in fact, it's not actually, we have reduced beef consumption in the US. That has gone to chicken. So the reason our emissions and our land use hasn't grown even more is because of a massive increase in chicken consumption. Now, I'd much rather be a cow than be a chicken. But the reality is that we get tremendously more food per hectare of land and per unit of greenhouse gas emissions from chicken than from beef. So the actual farm, that ranch alone, it's going to look a lot better. It's going to have a lot more diversity. It's going to have a lot better things if it's well grazed. But it's going to produce a heck of a lot less food than if you even use it for crops and feed it to chicken.
So wait a second, Tim. I want to pause on this. You're saying that chicken production actually contributes more greenhouse gases?
No, it's a fraction per unit of meat compared to beef.
It's better.
And much better from a pure
It's
greenhouse
better.
gas standpoint. Now, chicken has all kinds of other humane issues, and it has all kinds of other concentrated pollution issues. But from a greenhouse gas standpoint, it's about 1/10 of the greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of protein or beef.
Nicolette, do you agree with that?
Okay, with respect to that narrow sliver of a question
Yeah.
of the greenhouse gas emissions, it is less for chicken. Yes, that's true.
Okay.
However, this whole premise that you reduce the productivity when you put grazing animals on it is wrong. Again, citing, there are many, many other examples, but the Gabe Brown example, his name is Gabe Brown, example is really telling and poignant because he's documented what he's done. So he worked really closely with USDA soil scientists and monitored how much carbon was being sequestered, et cetera. So he's not only a very intelligent person who can articulate what he's done really well, but he has also documented it using PhD soil scientists, et cetera. And what he has shown is the total productivity of his land has dramatically increased. And not just that, but the nutritional quality of what he is producing has dramatically improved. So one of the sort of unspoken issues that people who are really deeply involved in food and agriculture know about, but a lot of people in the general public don't know, is that the general nutritional quality of food has dramatically declined in the last half century or so. And nobody really knows exactly why, but there are a lot of theories about why this has happened. And one of the main, the strongest theories is that the quality of the soil has declined so much now. And the biological activity of the soil has declined so much. So people in the regenerative agriculture movement that Gabe Brown and others are part of are showing that when you use cattle in a diverse operation, they enhance the productivity of the operation, they enhance the nutritional quality of the operation, and it's really about complexity. I want to go back to this point about a cow not being a car. It's a really important point. I heard a wonderful talk a few years ago by a physicist and philosopher, Dr. Fritjof Capra, who's the founder of the Center for I forgot the name of it. It's ecology, the eco-literacy, thank you. Sorry, blanked for a second. It's based in Berkeley. But he says the biggest problem with modern thinking and science and with how it relates to food production in particular is that we think of things in a linear fashion. And he's written books about systems thinking. And he says nothing in nature is linear. That is what a machine, those are human created machines that function in a linear fashion. And so when you look at the implications of a cow or a cattle animal in an ecosystem, you have to consider all of its connections and all of the ramifications that it has on the soil, on the insect life, on the water holding capacity. All of these things come into play, whereas a car is something that you can simply look at in terms of its inputs and outputs. It's a very different thing. It's like comparing, the sort of apples and oranges comparison. And so you have to consider those issues when you talk about how many cattle we should have on the land. And I believe that we should have more cattle in the United States today. Because if we did, we would have more biologically healthy soils. We would have more biologically healthy food systems, and we would have more nutrient-dense food. And because we have so many health problems connected to diet today, I think that we're desperately needing that kind of thing. And beef and butter and milk are incredibly nutrient-rich foods, and the foods that are being produced off of these regenerative agricultural operations are the kinds of foods that we need more of in this food system. So I think we're just sending the wrong message, again, to policymakers and consumers when we say the key is to reduce.
Okay.
That's just an oversimplification.
All right, I like to try to get to some data. So there's apparently a report called Livestock's Long Shadow, which I have not read, but my guess is both of you have read it, put up by the UN, and it was highlighted in a documentary called Cowspiracy. And I gather one of the theses of this is that cows contribute to climate change. And I'm still trying to get a sense of whether there's an agreement between you two, or we can get to an agreement on that linkage between livestock production and climate change. Tim, you're saying there is, and it's clearly documented, I gather.
There's the scientist in the world that I'm aware of who wouldn't say that we have massive greenhouse gas emissions associated with livestock production. You can debate on the details of the numbers, but you have methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. You have nitrous oxide, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. They come from, enteric methane comes from cattle digestion or any ruminants. Methane also comes from manure management. Nitrous oxide comes from urine deposits on grazing land, and actually nitrogen deposited on grazing land emits nitrous oxide at roughly twice the rate even of nitrogen applied, fertilizer applied to crops. And then on top of that, you have massive amounts of forest being converted to expand production. And most of that is actually going to produce beef in Latin America and to some extent in Africa. And
Not true.
well, it is true. But
I was in Brazil, and I've talked to
I
quite
see.
a few
Wait,
people
let's-
who have researched and studied Brazil, including many Brazilian academics who have explained that the cattle are not the driver for the deforestation. It's a huge difference.
All right,
And
Tim,
I can talk about that at length.
okay, I'm going to give you a chance. Just Tim,
Avery has also studied Brazil,
Yeah.
so he can talk about that later.
Tim, do you have a percentage? I mean,
Yeah, so agriculture is about 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and about half of that is ruminants. So just ruminants, not just meat. Meat would be more like 2/3. And actually, it's even worse than that in a way, which is that that assumes that we assign no cost to all of the forests we've cleared to produce food production. And that actually has a huge carbon opportunity cost. And most strategies to solve climate change require that we reforest substantial areas. Now, what areas do they want to reforest? They basically focus on reforesting wetter grazing land because it produces dramatically less food than cropland, but because it was historically forested, you could reforest that. So if you look at all the strategies, nature-based solutions to climate change. Now, to do that, we need to do two things. We need to produce beef even more efficiently, including improved grazing, and I work on improved grazing systems in Brazil and in Colombia and in Africa. And we need, in almost all cases, you're going to need at least some crops. It is inherently much less efficient even to graze animals unless you have at least some feed supplements. And we need to hold down our consumption. If the rest of the world, what people don't realize is in 2050, when we have this problem of 50% more food and 80%, 70% more livestock products, 2/3 of the world, or 60% of the world, still eats incredibly few animal products. So even that problem which I've designed, 6 billion people in the world are eating very few animal products. If they even eat a little bit more, then basically we need another planet. So the only way to make room for them to even eat a little bit more is for us to eat less. So yes, if you can have beautiful grazing systems, and I'm a big advocate of improved grazing systems, but no, if you try to feed the world with more grazing systems, you'd need 2 other planets. And it's just a physical reality, and it is an overwhelming scientific consensus. And so, I'm sorry. And I have studied Brazil too, and had papers about it, and Colombia as well.
Nicolette, what do you think of Tim's thesis about the role of agriculture, livestock in climate change?
Okay, well, first let's go back to this point about there's no debate about whether you'd need a great expansion of land. That is not true, because as I was saying, Dr. Teague and others have demonstrated that where you improve grazing practices, you can have 4 to 5 times more production on the same amount of land. So that assumption is wrong. Now, with respect to the emissions, there's no question that animal agriculture, as well as plant agriculture, does produce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, let's look at I wrote an essay about this for the New York Times, in fact, a few years ago. And I advocated that you have to look at the issues separately in terms of the gases. So when you look at carbon dioxide emissions, they're pretty minimal for meat production, in particular for beef production. And when you have grass-based systems, they're very low because you don't have the mechanization. And much of the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture in terms of the CO2 comes from the mechanized process. And actually you can do, and much of the world does grazing with almost no mechanization. So that is not so much of a concern when you talk about beef. The nitrous oxide emissions, again, that was an interesting statement about the manure, but research at UC Berkeley indicates that the primary nitrous oxide problem in the agricultural sector is from fertilizers. So again, that is a concern about food production. I think, in fact, it's the biggest concern. But it is not something that you have to have in beef systems. And in fact, the vast majority of the time that cattle are alive, even in the United States, they are out on grass, okay? Because all the mother cows live their lives on grass, the bulls, the calves are on grass. It's really just the animals that are, the sort of yearling animals that are being brought in off the fields and put into feedlots. They're not on grass anymore. But the majority of the animals in the system at any given time are on grass. So feed is something that is only one part of the system. And you can have, in fact, I advocate for beef production absent any of the feeding, okay? So again, this doesn't mean that you don't do beef, it means you do it differently.
So would you advocate as a policy solution greater regulation of the production of beef?
I don't know.
Is that,
I don't think
because we have to get
regulation is necessarily the problem. I think what we have is we have very distorted systems, for example, in terms of what we subsidize in this country. We subsidize a lot of very bad agricultural practices, and in fact, the production of very unhealthy food. And a lot of that is the subsidy of grain. And actually, we heavily subsidize sugar as well, ironically. But we also subsidize corn, which is something that I think we should grow a lot less of in this country. And you should have less corn being used in animal production. And you should have a lot more usage of rangeland and pasture. In fact, there was a very interesting paper a few years ago. Dr. Teague, that I referenced before, was part of it, but it was a large group of soil scientists and sustainability professors, and it was published in 2016 in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation. And they argued in that piece that if we took the corn and soy areas of the upper Midwest and converted it to grazing cattle, you would have a much healthier ecosystem and you would produce better food. And they actually specifically quantified a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. I do want to say about methane too. That was the one thing I didn't talk about yet. That's actually gets the most attention. And it's something I've looked at a lot for several years because of the fact that it's a real issue with beef. And there's no question that methane is produced by cattle, both in terms of the manure, but almost the vast majority of it from the enteric fermentation. Okay, so what about that? One thing that's happening is agricultural colleges all around the world are researching how to reduce methane emissions. And rice production in the 1980s was actually the leading anthropogenic source of from agriculture of methane, and they dramatically reduced it. And what's happening in the cattle industry now is there's a lot of research being put into reducing methane emissions through grazing practices and even through soil or feed amendments like seaweed, which has been shown to reduce methane by 70 to 90%.
I'm just going to have to.
And finally, the most important point is Dr. Miles Allen, who is a physicist at Oxford University and was on the scientific advisory panel for the IPCC for several years. And I heard him speak this summer, and I met him, and I spoke with him about this. And he said the entire method for calculating methane emissions that we're using today is wrong, and it doesn't work at all for cattle. He says you have a historic, because methane is so short-lived, and he's advocating that we should completely change the way the accounting is done for methane. And he says that the focus on cattle is totally misplaced because those are natural cycling emissions with a very short half-life of about 10 years, and they are actually simply basically holding up a certain level, but they do not contribute to warming. And he's written a number of papers about this, and he's one of the world's leading experts on
methane. It's important to get some of the facts right.
Okay.
So, this is really, so the idea that rice is a larger source of methane than cattle, that's just
no, that isn't what I said. I said in the 1980s.
Let's Tim talk. Let's let Tim talk.
Rice was never close to the emissions, and rice emissions also haven't even gone down. So you got to get some of the facts right. And if on the methane issue, it's interesting. So you have this debate on methane versus carbon dioxide. But if you are focused on trying to avoid catastrophic early warming today, so if you're trying to prevent us from crossing tipping points today, then actually that normal way we evaluate methane understates significantly, because the potency of methane is about 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide over 100 years, but it's many, many times more potent than that over 20 years. And so actually, if what you're trying to do is avoid the real risk that we're dealing with right now before we get our act together of holding down climate change so we don't cross thresholds, then actually there are other papers pointing out the enormous benefits to methane reduction. So, so actually it's probably an understatement in my view, even these numbers that we...
All right. I'm going to ask... We're going to move to questions in a few minutes. That's why Melanie's standing. Wait. I've got two questions, and then we're going to turn to audience questions. So one of the themes that's sort of emerging, at least in Tim's work, is this notion of the United States versus the rest of the world. And one of the things that at least I heard from you, Tim, is that as the rest of the world starts eating more beef, there's going to be more pressure on some of the systems. So there's an argument that because the U.S. livestock grazes on land that wouldn't otherwise be used, the environmental impact of cattle is different here than around the world. I know, Tim, your work focuses on global meat consumption, but I gather you disagree with this position in the U.S. That's Nicole's position,
actually,
right?
The interesting thing is that the reason, and Sarah will defend this, Sarah Place, the defender of beef here, she will confirm that the reason we have lower greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of beef in the U.S. is precisely because we have so much crops in our feed production. Now, I don't like feedlots at all. I spent a lot of my career trying to improve feedlots and all these other things. But actually, you get dramatically fewer greenhouse gas emissions when you feed crops to finish a beef for two unfortunate reasons. One reason is that you just feed a cow a lot more quickly. So every day a cow stays alive, it has to eat to support itself, it produces methane. And so when you finish a cow on crops, you actually finish it a lot more quickly. And then on top of that, it just gains weight a lot more. They're just more digestible. So the reason actual greenhouse gas emissions from beef production in the US are much lower than they are in Latin America or Africa or any other part of the world except Europe, which is kind of comparable, is because we rely heavily on crops. Now, as I said, I work on improved grazing systems too. So I'm working on these intensive silvopastoral systems in Colombia where you can dramatically increase your production, get some carbon. We need all of the above strategies. But actually there isn't a paper in the world that will not confirm that from a methane and nitrous oxide and land use standpoint, in general, when you add crops, you actually reduce emissions. But most beef outside of the US, and to some extent Europe, most beef is almost entirely grass-based. So in Brazil, there's very little crop supplement. It's almost entirely grass-based. And it's also very inefficient. And you can make it more efficient, but not as efficient as in the US. So the bottom line is we have this global challenge, and it's important that we improve beef production, including through good grazing systems. And I'm a huge admirer of really good rotational grazing systems by ranchers in the US, as I am of those farmers in Latin America who do it as well. But it's a luxury. It's an inherent luxury. It's like saying, we've got a really efficient truck, or, we have a very efficient airplane. It's just a fundamentally inefficient thing, and that's why we have to hold it down, our consumption of beef.
Okay, quickly, Nicolette.
Quickly. There are at least 2 papers that suggest, that are very recent, and one was a multi-year study done at Michigan State University, and it says that grass-fed cattle produce, if you take all of the emissions for the inputs and all of the sequestration that happens in the soil from their grazing, it is actually a net benefit to the climate because it sequesters more carbon than all of the emissions, including the methane. Okay. That's one important paper that directly contradicts what we just said. And the other thing, a smaller, less significant from an academic standpoint, but important paper was done on the White Oak Pastures farm, Will Harris's farm in Bluffton, Georgia, which I've also visited. And he's also a very credible person. And they had an environmental assessment done of the entire farm. It's a very diverse farm with a lot of different crops. And they found that the most climate-friendly thing they do on their farm, and they have lots of different kinds of plants and animals, was the beef, because it sequesters way more carbon than anything else. And in fact, it sequesters more carbon than, again, the total output. Okay, so it is not true that it is inherently bad for the climate.
Very briefly, so there is no evidence that overall we are sequestering more carbon on our grazing land in the U.S. But it is true, if you take cropland out of production and you reestablish it as grassland, you will sequester carbon for a temporary period of time. Now, that won't...
Yeah, but that wasn't what those 2 studies were about.
That is exactly what White Oak did, is it took cropland out of production and it reestablished grazing, and it claimed very large carbon sequestration, which is probably inaccurate. It's just too high. But you can sequester quite a lot of carbon, and but you're not getting the crops. So you got to produce the crop somewhere else. So the thing is, this treats land as a free asset. So if land were free, if you brought land into existence, this would be true. But you 1 hectare of land, use it one way versus another. And so that's basically the story. And for a temporary period of time, it won't equal it. I just did my own calculations.
They produce more food now there than they did before.
All right.
There are some highly degraded grazing lands that or croplands that probably could be better grazed. I'm not defending cropping all cropland, but on a more than small scale, that's not feasible.
All right, let's see if we can get an agreement on this. The consumption of beef and milk is dropping. Americans are eating more chicken, drinking more plant milks. Do you agree that this is a good thing? Is this the trend? Are plant-based meats part of the key here? Quickly.
Well,
and then we're going to turn to the audience.
Nicolette,
you first.
Definitely not, because first of all, this larger ecological picture, the grazing animals are an essential part. And it really shouldn't be focusing on mitigating the negative impacts. It should be focusing on using them as ecologically beneficial tools. And the food that's produced from those operations is far healthier than the alternatives. I just wrote an article for the Sustainable Food Trust a few weeks ago about the health and nutrition questions and ecological questions of fake meat. And I would argue it is a net negative versus real meat.
Okay, Tim.
So unfortunately, the main trend has not been to actually reduce meat consumption. It's basically been to switch to chicken. However, I do think the plant-based meats are enormous opportunity. They could be one of the main things that ultimately save the planet. And that's because every strategy for solving climate change requires that we manage to reforest a substantial amount of forest land that has been converted to agriculture. And the best potential for doing that is probably tropical grazing land that was originally forest, like in the Amazon. And in order to do that, we have to hold down our meat consumption.
All right. Should we do some questions?
Sure.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I want to start by talking a little bit about some of the questions that I've gotten so far, and one of which is, a number of which are talking about the dietary implications. What is this a good diet? Is a vegan diet a good diet? I want to let folks know that those kinds of questions are going to be addressed in the panel after lunch, the consumption panel, and I'm not going to ask either Tim or Nicolette to weigh in on the is a vegan diet good for you? Okay. So, but I do want to, there's a number of questions we're talking about. We've talked a lot about data, and we've talked a lot about ranches, and we've talked a lot about production operations. We haven't really talked a lot about sort of the social implications of the, and so one of the things that people are asking about are, what are the social implications of moving away from a meat-based system? How is that going to affect our society in terms of the states that are dependent on ranching, for example? How is that going to affect the areas, particularly in northern New York, and the dairy farmers who are going out of business rather quickly? But then are these social implications? What are some ways in which we as a society, in terms of our government, our global governance systems, and our national governance systems, and maybe even our state governance systems, can sort of move toward a system that brings together both of the issues that both Tim and Nicolette are talking about?
So the short answer is we are not going to reduce our production of livestock products. The goal is to stop the increase or moderate the increase. We have not actually reduced our production of dairy. And every hectare of native grazing land, and probably every hectare of grazing land in the U.S. should continue to be and will continue to be used. We're facing, the population is, you have to appreciate the global significance of this. The population is growing from 7.5 billion to 10 billion, and the vast majority of people in the world eat incredibly few animal products because they're incredibly poor. Now, as they make any income at all, they're going to eat more. So the short answer is we are going to continue, and we should continue to produce at least as much. In fact, we should produce more beef in the U.S. because it's one of the more efficient places to produce it. And but we have to hold down consumption too, and then we'll export more. So we have to share. So that when people say, well, look, rich people overconsume, poor people underconsume, we should redistribute. How do you redistribute? What do you mean? What does it mean to redistribute? I'll tell you what it means to redistribute. It means we eat less meat, so we have fewer resources going into our diets, and that provides more food resources that other people can eat. That's how you do it. We're not going to eat less food. We're not going to eat fewer calories. That's how you do it. And so the short answer is, we're going to continue to produce that. The changes that are occurring, why are dairy farms in New York going out of production? And they're mostly being consolidated, is unfortunately, they're just gigantic economies of scale in agriculture and in dairy. So we used to have 50 cow farms. Even when I started working in agriculture 20 years ago, there were 50 cow farms. And then they were taken over by 250 cow dairies, now 500. And now the 500 cow dairies can't compete with the 1,000 cow dairies, multi-thousand cow dairies. And that's just, unfortunately, the reality of these gigantic economies of scale that we have in agriculture. So you can try to deal with other social mechanisms, but it's a very powerful force that is very hard to resist. So anyway, that's mine.
Well, as long as Tim's okay with us continuing, the farming and the ranching in the U.S., I guess I'm okay with that too. But I mean, honestly, the billion poor people in the world. I actually went to a really interesting conference a few years ago in Germany that was of livestock keepers from around the world. And it was a very interesting conference because there were people from Pakistan and Afghanistan and Argentina and all over the world. And the message that they were trying to make clear to the policymakers of the UN and other international bodies is how important livestock are to the poorest people of the world. And one of the really important things about the grazing animals is that you can graze them in land that you do not own. So the poorest people of the world have that mobile food and resource base, and also a crop not only requires you to have control over land for an extended period of time, but you have to wait till it is ready to be harvested, and then you harvest it, and it's all dependent on that calendar of the year. Whereas livestock not only are portable and can use these interstitial spaces for grazing, but they can also be, you can slaughter an animal or sell an animal when you need to. So it's basically like a portable ATM for the world's poorest people. I mean, I think this is one of the very important points that needs to be understood by first world people having this conversation about veganism and vilifying meat.
Louisa, I completely agree with that. However, it is also true that it adds up to not that much. So, I mean, for example, people ask about native pastoralists. And, native pastoralists is a wonderful cultural system under all kinds of threats. It's a tiny fraction of the world's meat production. And so in Africa, there's more.
Do you have in terms of the amount of meat available to people in low income, poor?
So most poor people don't eat meat. I mean, it's just almost none, or very rarely. I mean, it's just stunning. You have to recognize. So when you go from $1, it used to be $1 a day. Now it's inflation adjusted, $2 a day to $3.50 a day. Maybe you eat a tiny bit of meat. You know what you really eat more? Vegetable oil. Because now you can fry food. You get some calories. So there's this huge growing global demand for vegetable oil. Now, it comes from two sources. One is our damn biodiesel, which competes with that. But the other is just poor people being a little bit less poor. So, I want to make some room for these people to be able to eat some livestock products. And the best health example, so if you are extremely poor, eating a little bit of meat has enormous health benefits, mainly for not even the protein, it's the micronutrients.
Yes, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that.
But the point is that that's a different story from holding down the consumption. So it becomes like, well, would the world be better off if we abolished meat production? And the answer is no. But we're not talking about abolishing meat production. We're talking about trying to prevent an 80% increase and hold that down to maybe a 20% increase. And part of that is that rich people have to consume less. And we is rich people.
But the reality is, if you had Americans reducing consumption of beef, for example, there's absolutely no evidence that people in the poorer parts of the world would get more of the beef. I mean, that just isn't how world trade works. So what we really need to be focusing on, again, is making agricultural systems sustainable in the geographies where they exist and allowing people to be able to
let me ask
feed their communities and themselves.
Frank Mitloner, who is normally on this beef side, he wrote this article saying, yeah, you know what happened was we held down our beef consumption and now we export a lot to Japan. And it's true. We export beef. And there's going to be huge demand for beef, and we should export beef.
Okay, so let me ask one last question because we're getting and there's lots of questions, and I'm kind of combining them together. But there will be opportunities to ask more of these questions throughout the day. There's a lot of I hear a lot about the cow versus the how. And I hear a lot. So one of the reasons why I wanted both of you up on stage together is that you hear the conversation from the regenerative agriculture agroecologists. You hear the conversation from the climate change, environmental folks, and there's not very often a time when are you both on the same stage.
Yeah. So I'm in favor of both. I keep saying over and over again, we need to improve the quality of our production.
Okay, but I need to ask you about the quality of the production.
Okay. So we need to, we do that in various ways. Now the idea.
But one of the ways in which you seem to be talking about it is that we can't let go of our animal feeding operations, our CAFOs.
Yeah, no, it is a fact that you will have much more methane and much more nitrous oxide if you don't use any crops. And now in most of the world, however, we're talking about minimal crops. So in Latin America, it's all about improved grazing systems. And here we can definitely improve our grazing systems too. But if we got rid of all crops, we would have dramatically less production, require dramatically more land, and have dramatically more methane. So probably the ideal efficient system might be one that has really good grazing and also has some crop feed. And I think it's very unfortunate. Now, here's another example. In Europe, you have a lot fewer emissions per unit of beef, mainly because almost all the beef comes from dairy. And so you're getting this double product. And so when you kind of allocate it out in an appropriate way, your beef is a lot lower. But they can do that in part because they produce a lot less beef relative to the amount of dairy that they produce. So the thing is, in an ideal world, you'd have kind of some combination. But I'm a big believer in improved grazing systems, and in most of the world, that's where any improvement.
Can we talk a little bit about chicken? Mm-hmm. Because I think that's a number of us have switched to eating much more chicken,
right, yeah.
Because we've heard that and there's a number of questions about what are where do we go? What is the next steps from here? And so can you see a way of creating and a number of people are concerned about things like animal welfare, which we will be talking a lot about in the afternoon, of chicken operations. And so I know there's a cow, it's the how. Is there a chicken, it's the how too? And
so chicken is. I think we have a big opportunity to reduce our chicken consumption too, because we're going to have. We eat a tremendous amount of meat in processed products like chicken nuggets or things like that. And I think there's every reason to believe we can make perfectly satisfactory plant-based chicken nugget equivalents. Having said that,
how about just stopping eating that stuff altogether?
Well, that would be better too. We have to hold down our consumption of everything, right? Or all resource-intensive foods. Having said that, it is really unfortunate in a way, but it's true that chicken, all these horrible ways we raise chicken from a pure resource and greenhouse gas standpoint are ridiculously efficient. So the fact that a chicken now grows to slaughter weight in 6 weeks, that means the amount of feed that you need to produce per pound is incredibly low. Now that's cruel, but it's efficient. And so you have to.
So how do we balance between and this is
So
one
I
of the
think
questions.
I think the answer is we can be more humane.
And then
in the
we'll
way
get a wrap up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. If we can be more humane for sure in the ways we raise chicken. I'm working with the Danish Agriculture Association on pork, and their pork production is more humane than our pork production, but it's still,
Right, because EU has animal welfare rules.
Well, and they actually, because and also they're just better for various reasons. But they're more politically motivated there. But it's still not great. You don't want to be a pig, to be perfectly honest. But so we can do better in that. But the real main issue in those areas is going to be holding down, also trying to hold down the
Well, and I actually agree that it would probably be a good thing if people ate less chicken. And I've been in a lot of chicken operations, and I've seen a lot of videos of chicken operations, and they're very problematic from an animal welfare standpoint. And there are many other concerns as well. When I was working for Waterkeeper Alliance, a lot of my work was spent on dealing with the water quality issues that were the problems that were caused, and air quality problems caused by concentrated chicken operations. So I think rather than concentrating chicken operations more and more, it would be much better to simply reduce chicken consumption and production. That being said, again, these anecdotes are very, very important. We have a friend, Matthew Wadiak, who was trained as a chef and was one of the founders of Blue Apron, and who has just started something called Cook's Ventures, which is all about trying to do a larger scale chicken operation, but on pasture and with regenerative practices. And he's showing that this can be done. And he lives in New York, but this is being done in Arkansas. And there are models like this of people that are really trying to create, pasture-based foods of all the different sectors. And I think, I said in my first book, Righteous Pork Chop, I really believe if we need to reduce consumption in order to make it affordable or make the land available for this kind of production, that would be a good thing. I don't necessarily think everybody needs to keep, although I actually think people should eat more beef, I do think they should eat less chicken. But I think the total amount of food that we produce or eat should be balancing all these values, whether it's, water quality, air quality, animal welfare issues, community issues. I mean, when I used to go to a lot of farms in the upper Midwest, one of the things that was really clear was how people despised, people who were farming there for generations were working actively to stop the confinement operations from coming in. They hate that kind of production, but they're farmers, and they strongly believe in the value of it. And then these smaller scale operations that were doing pasture-based production were beloved in their community, and they fed their community, and they knew their neighbors. So there's a lot of issues at play here. And this question of the role of the farming operation in the community is a really important part of this question as well.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're going to continue, and we will ask more of the questions that you've been asking in the various. I will keep all of the questions for folks to find out more about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, we need to take this off.
Yes.
Right.